Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but when millions of dollars and a high society country club aesthetic are on the line, family ties evaporate in an instant. Some people will gladly sell their soul for a seat at the elite table. They just never expect their discarded sister to hold the receipt. Our father, William Gallagher, was not a subtle man. He built a commercial plumbing and HVAC empire in the harsh, unforgiving winters of Chicago. He was a man with dirt permanently settled into the creases of his knuckles, who wore scuffed steel-toe boots to high-end steakhouses, and who believed that family was the only currency that actually mattered. My older sister Helen and I were the sole heirs to his blood, sweat, and tears after our mother passed away when we were just kids. But Helen and I were forged from entirely different metals. I worshipped the ground Dad walked on. I spent my summers in the dispatch office, learning the business from the ground up, eventually taking over operations. Helen, on the other hand, spent her life running away from the scent of copper pipes and industrial grease. She hated our roots. To her, Dad's wealth was merely a tool to buy her way into circles that would otherwise look down on us. She wanted to be a socialite. She wanted the monogram towels, the Hampton summer homes, and the air of effortless, generational superiority that we simply didn't possess. When Dad died of a sudden massive heart attack 2 years ago, it shattered my world. For Helen, however, it seemed to serve as the ultimate emancipation. The reading of the will took place in the mahogany-paneled office of Dad's lifelong attorney and closest friend, Thomas Gibson. The estate was valued at a staggering $14 million to be split evenly between Helen and me. But Dad was no fool. He knew exactly who his eldest daughter was becoming, and he was deeply scarred by his own past. Decades ago, Dad's own brother had cut him out of his life over a petty financial dispute, barring him from funerals and weddings alike. Dad swore that his daughters would never repeat that cycle of vicious estrangement. So, he included a stipulation. It was formally known as Section 4, Paragraph B, but Thomas referred to it as the Gallagher Unity Clause. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, his voice thick with emotion, and read the condition aloud. The trusts established for Helen and Natalie Gallagher shall be distributed in annual dividends. However, this inheritance is contingent upon the absolute preservation of familial unity. If either beneficiary is found to maliciously, intentionally, and publicly exclude the other from significant, universally recognized family milestones, specifically defined as weddings, funerals, and the birth of a child without legally verifiable cause, such as a restraining order or documented abuse, the offending party shall immediately forfeit their remaining trust balance. Said balance will be transferred in its entirety to the wronged sibling. I remember Helen rolling her eyes, sighing loudly, and checking her designer watch. Dad was so dramatic, she scoffed, waving a manicured hand. Obviously, we're sisters. We're not going to banish each other. Can we just sign the paperwork, Tom? I have a flight to Aspen. She didn't take it seriously. Neither of us truly thought it would ever be enacted. But that was before she met Preston Harrington. Preston was the exact archetype of the man Helen had spent her entire adult life hunting. He was tall, possessed a suspiciously perfect jawline, and most importantly, came from old Boston money. The Harringtons were the kind of people who used summer as a verb and owned a crumbling, ivy-covered estate in Newport, Rhode Island. They reeked of generational privilege and looked at anyone who actually had to work for a living as if they were a strange, pitiable species of insect. From the moment Preston slid a diamond ring onto Helen's finger, my sister morphed into an entirely different person. Her Chicago accent disappeared, replaced by a bizarre, faux mid-Atlantic drawl. She stopped returning my calls. She scrubbed her social media of any photos of our father in his work gear. When she finally introduced me to Preston's mother, Eleanor Harrington, at a sterile, agonizingly quiet dinner party, I immediately understood why I was being erased. So, Natalie, Eleanor had purred, looking at me over the rim of her wine glass. Helen tells me you work in sanitation? Plumbing and commercial HVAC, Mrs. Harrington, I replied proudly. It's Dad's company. Helen and I own it. Helen kicked me sharply under the table, her smile tight and panic-stricken. Natalie is just an office manager, really. Very behind the scenes. Anyway, Preston, darling, tell your mother about the caterer we booked. That night was the beginning of the end. Helen wasn't just marrying a man, she was marrying into a status, and I was the dirty, blue-collar anchor, threatening to drag her down from the clouds. The wedding planning consumed Helen entirely. She hired a notoriously ruthless celebrity event planner named Giselle, and the budget quickly spiraled out of control. The event was to be held at the Harringtons' historic Newport estate, a sprawling property that, behind its grand gates, was secretly in desperate need of repair. That was the little secret I had figured out through the grapevine of high society contractors. The Harringtons were entirely cash poor. They had the name, the crest, and the land, but their bank accounts were running on fumes. Preston wasn't just marrying Helen for her new polished aesthetic. He was marrying her for the $7 million trust fund she was set to fully unlock upon her 30th birthday, which was conveniently just months after the wedding. They needed her money to fix their rotting roof and failing foundation. Despite the widening chasm between us, I naively assumed I would be the maid of honor. We were the only family each other had left. I bought a stunning, understated gown, booked a hotel room in Newport, and cleared my schedule for the entire week of the wedding. Then, the invitations went out. I saw pictures of them on Instagram, gorgeous, thick-cut vellum embossed with gold leaf. Friends of Helen posted unboxing videos of these lavish invites. I waited by my mailbox for a week. Nothing came. At first, I told myself it was lost in the mail. I texted Helen, "Hey B, haven't gotten my invite yet. Just want to know what time I should be there for the rehearsal dinner." She left me on red for 3 days. When I finally cornered her by calling her from my office landline, a number she didn't have blocked, she answered with a heavy, irritated sigh. "Natalie, look, I'm incredibly stressed right now," Helen snapped. "I just need the details, B. I know the mail has been weird, but I need to know when to fly out." There was a long, suffocating silence on the line. When she spoke again, her voice was cold, measured, and entirely unrecognizable. "You aren't flying out, Natalie." I froze. "What?" "You aren't invited," she said, her tone devoid of any emotion. "Look, Preston's family is incredibly traditional. Eleanor is hosting the event, and she's curating a very specific, high society aesthetic, a strict white tie European aristocrat vibe. And you, well, you don't fit the aesthetic." "I don't fit the aesthetic?" I repeated, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising bile. "B, I'm your sister. Dad just died 2 years ago. I'm the only family you have to walk you down the aisle." "Don't guilt-trip me, Natalie," she fired back viciously. "You're an embarrassment, frankly. You show up with calluses on your hands and talk about pipe fittings and union strikes. You make Preston's parents profoundly uncomfortable. This is my special day, my one chance to solidify my place in this family, and I am not having it ruined by my sweaty, tomboy sister. It's a closed guest list. Do not show up." Before I could even process the cruelty of her words, she hung up. I sat in Dad's old leather chair in the dispatch office, staring at the wall until my eyes blurred with tears. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced. My own flesh and blood, the girl I had shared a bedroom with, the girl I had comforted at Dad's funeral, was throwing me away like trash because I didn't look right standing next to her rich new friends. Our Aunt Evelyn and Cousin Jenna, who were also explicitly excluded from the wedding, called me later that evening, furious. They had tried to appeal to Helen, but she had ruthlessly blocked their numbers. She was cutting away the Gallagher family root and stem. For 24 hours, I let myself mourn. I cried for the sister I had lost. And I cried for my dad, wishing he were here to knock some sense into her. But on the morning of the second day, the grief evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline anger. I walked over to the office safe, spun the dial, and pulled out the thick manila folder containing Dad's estate documents. I flipped to Section 4, Paragraph B, the Gallagher Unity Clause. Maliciously, intentionally, and publicly exclude the other from significant, universally recognized family milestones, specifically defined as weddings, shall immediately forfeit their remaining trust balance. Helen had just triggered the trap, but I knew that a phone call wasn't enough to stand up in probate court. I needed undeniable, bulletproof evidence. I needed her malicious intent in writing. I opened my laptop and drafted a carefully worded email to Helen and her wedding planner, Giselle. I kept my tone incredibly polite, playing the part of the desperate, heartbroken sister. "Dear Helen, I am writing to formally beg you to reconsider your decision to ban me from your wedding on the 14th. I am willing to sit in the back, away from Preston's family, and I promise not to speak about the family business. As your only sister, it breaks my heart to be excluded from the most significant milestone of your life. Please let me attend. Love, Natalie. I hit send, knowing exactly how Helen's ego operated. She wouldn't be able to resist putting me in my place, especially with her snooty wedding planner copied on the chain. 4 hours later, my inbox pinged. It was from Giselle's professional email, but signed by Helen. It was a masterpiece of arrogance. Natalie, my decision is final. You are formally and explicitly barred from attending my wedding, the rehearsal, and any associated events. Your blue-collar background and refusal to assimilate into the high society standards of the Harrington family make you a liability to my reputation. You are maliciously excluded not by accident, but by my design. If you attempt to access the Newport estate on the day of the wedding, I have instructed Giselle to have private security physically remove you for trespassing. Do not contact me again. Helen. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a fierce rhythm against my ribs. She had used the exact language required to trigger the clause. She had put it in writing, signed her name to it, and sent it through a third-party witness. I printed the email, grabbed the estate folder, and immediately drove to Thomas Gibson's law office. When I slid the printed email across the mahogany desk, Thomas read it in silence. He read it twice. Slowly, he took off his reading glasses and looked up at me. There was no pity in his eyes, only the sharp, calculating gleam of a lawyer who was about to execute a flawless maneuver. She is entirely reliant on the trust payout to fund this new lifestyle, isn't she? Thomas asked quietly. Every penny of it, I replied. Preston's family is broke. They're using her inheritance as collateral for the estate renovations. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a grim, satisfied smile touching the corners of his mouth. William would have been heartbroken to see her act this way, but he would be incredibly proud of you for holding her accountable. He tapped the paper. This is a direct, undeniable violation of Section 4, Paragraph B. The morality clause has been breached. So, what happens now? I asked, leaning forward. Now, Thomas said, opening his laptop. We let her have her dream wedding. We let her make her vows, cut her cake, and promise millions of dollars to the Harrington family. And the moment the ink is dry on her marriage certificate, I file the injunction to freeze her accounts and strip her of every last dime. The trap was armed. All Helen had to do was walk down the aisle. The weekend of the wedding arrived, and I spent it entirely in Chicago, sitting at Dad's heavy oak desk at Gallagher Commercial Plumbing. While I was reviewing quarterly supply chain manifests and approving overtime for our union crews, my phone was relentlessly pinging with updates from Rhode Island. Helen's PR-obsessed wedding planner, Giselle, had ensured that the event had its own dedicated hashtag. I watched the spectacle unfold in high definition through the screens of mutual acquaintances and eager social climbers. The Harrington estate in Newport looked breathtaking, at least from the carefully curated angles that hid the peeling paint on the upper cornices and the sagging roofline of the east wing. Helen wore a custom, hand-embroidered gown that cost more than most of our plumbers made in a year. Preston looked like a catalog model in his sharply tailored white-tie tailcoat. There were ice sculptures, imported orchids cascading from the ceiling of the grand tent, and a 6-tier cake wrapped in edible gold. In every photo, Helen beamed with the desperate, triumphant energy of a woman who believed she had finally scrubbed the blue-collar grime from her pedigree. She had successfully hidden her sister, her roots, and her father's legacy behind a wall of checkbooks and NDAs. But behind the scenes, Thomas Gibson was orchestrating a masterpiece of legal timing. Dad's trust was structured so that upon her 30th birthday, which she had celebrated 2 months prior, and upon the provision of a certified marriage license, Helen's half of the estate would fully liquefy. $7 million was set to transfer from the Gallagher, holding accounts directly into a newly established joint trust, managed by the Harrington family's wealth advisors. The transfer was scheduled for execution at 9 a.m. on the Monday following the wedding. At 4:55 p.m. on Friday, just before the courthouse closed for the weekend, Thomas formally filed the injunction to freeze Helen's accounts, citing a direct, irrefutable breach of the Gallagher Unity Clause. He attached Helen's own cruel email as Exhibit A. The judge, a no-nonsense man who actually remembered my father's charitable work in the city, signed the emergency freeze order immediately. The money was locked. Helen was effectively penniless, but she wouldn't know it until Monday morning. William's will stipulates that the executor must deliver the notice of forfeiture in person, with the superseding beneficiary present, if a breach of this magnitude occurs. Thomas told me over the phone on Sunday evening. "Pack a bag, Natalie. We have a 6 a.m. flight to Providence." Monday morning in Newport was foggy and damp, the sea air heavy with the smell of salt and old secrets. Thomas and I pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of the Harrington estate in a rented black SUV at exactly 8:45 a.m. This morning was the infamous Harrington post-nuptial brunch, an intimate, exclusive gathering meant only for the inner circle. More importantly, it was the financial closing of the weekend. Through the contractor grapevine, I knew that Richard Caldwell, a highly sought-after and famously impatient historical renovation specialist, was attending. He was there to secure a $2.5 million wire, transfer the non-refundable deposit to begin gutting and saving the crumbling Harrington mansion. We approached the front door, which was flanked by massive stone urns. Before we could even knock, a burly private security guard named Brody stepped into our path, crossing his arms. "Private event," Brody grunted. "Guest list only." Before I could speak, Thomas stepped forward, his posture radiating the terrifying authority of a seasoned corporate litigator. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "My name is Thomas Gibson. I am the legal executor of the William Gallagher estate. I am here serving a court-ordered financial injunction upon Helen Gallagher. If you attempt to obstruct a court officer in the execution of legal service, I will have the Newport police here in 3 minutes to arrest you for interference. Step aside." Brody blinked, looked at the thick manila envelope in Thomas's hand, and wisely stepped back, pulling the hay oak door open. The scene inside the grand dining room was a portrait of relaxed, arrogant wealth. Crystal mimosas caught the morning light. Preston and Helen sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, looking exhausted but victorious. Eleanor Harrington was holding court at the other end, chatting animatedly with Richard Caldwell, the contractor, whose blueprints were literally rolled out over the fine linen tablecloth. When my heels clicked against the hardwood floor of the foyer, the conversation in the dining room died a sudden, agonizing death. Helen looked up, and the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a porcelain mask. Her eyes darted from me to Thomas, panic flaring in her chest. "Natalie," she hissed, standing up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. "What are you doing here? You were explicitly barred from this property. Brody, security." Giselle, the wedding planner, materialized from a side hallway, her clipboard clutched to her chest. "Excuse me, you need to leave immediately. This is a private, family-only brunch." "I am family," I said, my voice eerily calm, echoing in the cavernous, silent room. "And this isn't a social call, B." Preston stood up, puffing out his chest, trying to look imposing. "Natalie, this is incredibly inappropriate. My wife made her boundaries clear. You are trespassing." "Actually, Mr. Harrington, she is legally required to be here," Thomas interrupted, stepping past me and approaching the table. He didn't look at Preston. He locked eyes directly with Helen. He placed the thick folder onto the mahogany table, right on top of Richard Caldwell's blueprints. "Helen Gallagher," Thomas said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "As of 4:55 p.m. on Friday, a judge of the state of Illinois signed an emergency injunction freezing all assets, trusts, and dividends associated with your inheritance from the William Gallagher estate. The $7 million scheduled to transfer to the Harrington joint accounts this morning has been legally halted." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that sucks the oxygen out of the room. I watched Eleanor Harrington's hand freeze halfway to her mouth, her mimosa glass trembling slightly. "What?" Helen breathed, her voice cracking. "Thomas, what is this? You can't do this. The money is mine." "The money was yours, contingent upon the stipulations your father laid out in his will," Thomas corrected sharply. He opened the folder and pulled out a crisp, white sheet of paper. Section 4, Paragraph B, the Gallagher Unity Clause. It strictly prohibits the malicious, intentional, and public exclusion of your sibling from major life milestones, specifically including weddings, without legally verifiable cause. Preston laughed nervously, a tight, ugly sound. That's absurd. That's a morality clause. You can't enforce that over a guest list. It is highly enforceable when the beneficiary puts their malicious intent into writing, Thomas countered smoothly. He held up the paper. It was the email. On Tuesday, Helen explicitly stated in an electronic communication, transmitted through a third-party witness, her wedding planner, that she was barring her sister from the wedding. I quote, "You are maliciously excluded not by accident, but by my design." Helen stared at the paper, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She had thought she was being powerful and elite when she typed those words. Now, they were a financial death warrant. Because of this documented, undeniable breach, Thomas continued, turning to look at me, the entirety of Helen's remaining trust balance has been forfeited. Per your father's instructions, those funds are currently being legally transferred into the sole possession of Natalie Gallagher. No, Helen whispered, gripping the edge of the table. No, 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 Natalie, please. You wouldn't. You can't take everything. I didn't take anything, B, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. You threw it away. You threw me away because I didn't fit the aesthetic of a family that is so broke they need Dad's plumbing money to fix their roof. At that, Eleanor Harrington gasped, dropping her glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Richard Caldwell, the contractor who had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, slowly reached out and rolled up his blueprints. His face was a mask of furious realization. He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Harrington," Caldwell said, his tone dangerously low, "you assured me the $2.5 million deposit would be wired by 9 a.m. today. Was this inheritance the capital you were leveraging for my contract?" Eleanor stammered, her regal composure crumbling into panicked dust. "Richard, please, we can explain. There's just a temporary legal misunderstanding." "I don't do misunderstandings, Eleanor," Caldwell snapped, snatching his leather briefcase. "My crews were supposed to start structural shoring tomorrow. You are a liability. The contract is void." He turned and marched out of the dining room without another word. The dominoes were falling, and they were falling fast. Preston turned slowly to look at Helen. The charming, affectionate facade he had worn all weekend had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating glare that made my stomach churn. "Preston," Helen whimpered, reaching out for his arm. "Darling, we can fight this. We'll hire our own lawyers. We'll contest the will." Preston violently jerked his arm away from her touch. "Fight it with what money, Helen? You just lost $7 million because you had to send a catty email to your sister." "Preston, don't speak to me like that. I did this for us, for your mother's aesthetic," Helen cried, tears finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her makeup. "My mother's aesthetic requires capital," Preston shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You told us this money was guaranteed. We signed venue contracts, catering agreements, and vendor guarantees based on your trust fund. We are millions of dollars in debt for this weekend alone, and you have absolutely nothing." Watching them turn on each other was like watching a pack of starving wolves. There was no love in that room. There was no loyalty. It was a purely transactional marriage, and the currency had just run out. Helen had traded a father who worshipped her, and a sister who would have taken a bullet for her, all for a husband who despised her, the second her bank account hit zero. "Thomas, we're done here," I said, suddenly feeling entirely exhausted by the pathetic display in front of me. I turned to my sister one last time. "Dad didn't write that clause to control us, B. He wrote it to protect us from becoming exactly what you became. Have a nice life." I didn't wait for her response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the Harrington estate, the heavy front door shutting with a resounding thud behind me, sealing Helen inside the gilded cage of her own making. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 3 weeks, Preston Harrington filed for a quiet, expedited annulment, citing fraud and misrepresentation of assets. The Harrington family, now completely underwater with the wedding debt and without the capital to fix their estate, was forced to quietly sell the Newport property to a commercial developer at a massive loss. Helen tried to call me a dozen times, leaving voicemails caught somewhere between furious demands for her money and weeping apologies. I never answered. I blocked her number, just like she had done to me. She eventually moved into a small apartment in Boston, taking a job as a receptionist at a boutique PR firm, the very type of job she used to mock. As for me, I took the entirety of Dad's $14 million legacy and poured it back into Gallagher Commercial Plumbing. I expanded our operations into 2 neighboring states, gave every single one of our union workers a 10% raise, and established a scholarship fund in Dad's name for young women entering the trade industries. I kept my calloused hands, my steel-toe boots, and the knowledge that true wealth isn't about the name stitched into your collar. It's about the people who stand beside you when the money is gone. Thank you so much for tuning into this crazy story. If you want to hear more insane real-life drama, betrayal, and ultimate karma, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hitting the bell icon ensures you never miss out on the wildest family feuds and revenge stories we have coming up next. Your support means everything, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think.